Please wake up.
So I decided to test Kling 3.0 by recreating the Trunks and Gohan scene from Dragon Ball Z, The History of Trunks, 1993. I was honestly surprised by what is actually possible with Kling 3.0. At the beginning, I didn't have much hope that it would come out this good, but after the first scene generated, I realized it might actually work. Of course, only a few shots were good on the first try. Most scenes required 2 or 3 generations, and some needed 4 to 6. Those costs definitely start adding up. I started by generating different versions of Trunks. Here are some of the variations I made. Most of them didn't really feel right. But then I got this one, which I really liked. I also experimented with how he might look in his Super Saiyan form. In the end, I used a slightly different version, but this is roughly how I imagined it. Next, I moved on to Gohan. I created a few different versions. This one was missing a belt, but it wasn't terrible. I actually liked the next version the most visually, but the spandex undershirt didn't really work for me. I could have fixed it, but instead I decided to generate something new. Eventually, I got this version. It doesn't really give strong Gohan vibes, but it still looked cool and had most of the details right. He looked like a hardened warrior in a destroyed world. Honestly, I probably should have used this version, but oh well. If I ever remake the scene where Gohan fights the androids, I'll probably replace him with this character. After finishing the characters, I started generating destroyed city environments that I could use for the scenes. Some variations worked really well, while many others were complete duds. Once I had the characters and environments ready, it was time to start bringing the anime scene to life. Originally, I planned to start directly with Trunks flying through the destroyed city, instead of showing him waking up. But turning that moment into a realistic scene was much harder than I expected. Controlling character poses and movement with prompts in Nano Banana Pro turned out to be pretty difficult. During one of those attempts, I accidentally generated this image, and that's when I realized that starting the story with Trunks waking up in the destroyed city might actually be a much better idea. I decided to give myself more freedom and make it a reimagining of the scene, rather than a direct remake. Because of that, my approach changed. Instead of trying to convert every anime shot into a realistic image, I started creating unique storyboards. My first attempt was using a 3x3 grid, where you describe what should appear in each panel. I created a few variations of this, and I also made a totally different version, just to see if something better could come out of it. I would say it didn't look bad. At first, when I saw the results, I was a bit conflicted about which version to choose. But in the end, I decided to stay with my initial storyboard. From each storyboard, I picked the best panels and put them into DaVinci Resolve, timing them according to how long I expected each shot to run. After I became satisfied with the animated storyboard, I started generating the videos. I extracted each panel, upscaled it with Nano Banana, and then fed it into Kling 3. This was the first video scene I generated. As you can see, there is some morphing happening, but in the final edit I zoomed in, so most of the mistakes are better masked. It seems that Kling 3 produces strange results when the first and last image don't perfectly align in space. In some generations, Kling 3 also confused background shapes and interpreted them as people in the background. The next scene, where he turns around, had too much morphing. However, it was still my favorite shot visually, even with those issues. It had that scrawny, skinny kid vibe, which is exactly what I wanted. I also tried using C-Dance 1.5. I would have tried C-Dance 2.0, but it wasn't widely available yet. Using the same first and last images, it handled the scene much better and didn't produce those morphing artifacts. However, I didn't like how Trunks looked. He appeared too muscular. I also tried another render with Kling 3, but this time I only gave it the first image. It did a better job, but Trunks still looked too buff. Since this was only the beginning of the project, and there were many more scenes to generate, I decided to save money and stick with the first version. Even though it had flaws, it was good enough, and I considered the part where he wakes up and realizes what happened finished. So in this part, Trunks is now searching for Gohan across the destroyed city. In my initial storyboards, I imagined that he would be flying in the distance for a few shots, but as an experiment, I had this different image that I wanted to test. And oh boy, when I used this image as the first frame, the first thing Kling generated was this. I have to be honest, I thought it was great. When I asked it to generate this flight scene, I didn't expect much, but I think it's safe to say that this was a very high quality generation. Sure, it has that extra arm issue at the end, which is why I didn't use it in the final version, but I was shocked by how good it looked. Here are some other variations. Some of them were duds, but this is the one I chose to use. It was simply the cleanest out of the bunch. Because that last flight shot was so good, I decided not to include those very distant shots from the storyboard, and instead jump straight to the next scene. The moment where Trunks is flying at high speed, stops in the air, and continues searching was a bit demanding to generate. It took a while before I managed to get something I was satisfied with. There were a lot of failed attempts. It could have been partly due to my prompting, but I would say Kling often struggled with generations that used both a first and last frame, which is what I used here. But eventually I started getting something closer to what I wanted. Here we have the moment when Trunks sees Gohan lying on the ground. I would say none of these were really what I wanted. All of them seemed a bit off in their execution, but because I was burning way too many credits, I had to stop. So I decided to stick with this one, which I think was the best generation. It works well with the previous shot, and still feels dynamic. The other shots were pretty straightforward. They didn't really have many bad takes. In this next part, I wanted the scene to feel more dramatic. Here are some of the storyboards I made. Some of them had really cool shots, but since I can't tell the same story 10 different ways, I had to choose one direction. In the end, I decided to go with a darker tone. I did experiment with some other variations to see if there were any cooler directions I could take. But ultimately, I stuck with this one. I know that in the anime, Gohan is lying face down, but after looking at some of the storyboards, I decided to place him on his back instead. Unfortunately, that meant I had to drop some of the cool shots where Gohan was face down, but to keep the scene consistent, I replaced them with some alternatives. The first shot was also a bit difficult to generate in Nano Banana. I wanted a larger distance between the characters to make the scene feel heavier and more dramatic, trying different compositions to push the characters further apart and increase that sense of distance. I also wanted to turn Gohan slightly to the side rather than lying perfectly horizontal, but eventually I gave up on that idea. After I had a consistent storyboard, it was time to generate the videos. I'll skip some of the more boring clips, but here are the best failed takes. In the prompt, I specified that the person on the ground was dead and wasn't moving, but it still tried to make him breathe, which was a bit annoying. Also, while trying to upscale this scene with Nano Banana, I ended up getting this image. I'm not sure why, but my guess is that explicitly mentioning Capsule Corp, orange gi, and purple hair triggered the model. Even though the scene of Trunks trying to pick up Gohan shouldn't have been that difficult, I ended up spending way too much time on it. I generated a lot of material while trying to get it right. I tried to find the best angle for the pickup, and of course, some hallucinations from the model showed up along the way. Eventually, I landed on this image, and these are the clips I got from it. Some of them were really dumb. Also, because the image doesn't contain enough information about the characters, you need to describe them again in the prompt. As you can see, I forgot to do that in this one.
Gohan, please wake up.
And finally, we come to the transformation. This was the part I was most worried about from the very beginning, because I had no idea if I could pull it off. I'm not saying the result is anything super special, but it turned out much better than I anticipated. For the transformation sequence, I generated a lot of Nano Banana images, trying to find the right look for the Super Saiyan form. But first, let's look at some of the storyboards I made for this part. As you can see, from time to time I get Dragon Ball style hair, which is probably triggered by words like golden aura or golden hair. When I use words like yellow, orange, or blonde, it doesn't produce those results. After generating the storyboards, I selected the panels that flowed well together, but I still didn't have a Super Saiyan look that I was satisfied with. The earlier version looked okay, but I felt like it could be better, so I kept experimenting. It took a while before I got something that looked decent. Eventually, I started seeing something I liked. In the end, I'm relatively happy with the final result, but I'm curious what you think. Was there any variation that you liked better? Let me know in the comments. Once the shots were ready, it was time to generate the videos. I started with the hands, because that felt like the easiest part. I liked how this generation handled the golden aura building up. And now we get to the hardest part of the whole project, him screaming at the top of his lungs. Generating clips with audio costs about 1.5 times more, so I only used audio generation when I thought the sound was necessary and would be difficult to recreate later or generate with 11 Labs. The scream was a bit of a mystery. It could turn out great, or it could be terrible. Some tests I tried with 11 Labs were disappointing.
No Gohan. Ah! No Gohan. Ah!
So I was a bit worried about what I would do if Kling generation didn't produce a good scream. Using screams from the original anime also wouldn't match the realistic character style. But luckily, Kling 3 generated some really good screams. They sounded surprisingly convincing. Granted, even though the screams were great, the visual quality could have been better. Some of these shots really look like they are a few versions behind in quality. Kling also struggled again with first and last image generation. The rocks were supposed to fly, and the whole scene was meant to feel chaotic. But because the only difference between the first and last image was the hair, the motion looked limited. It also refused to move the rocks or the rain droplets. However, if I provide only the first frame, then the magic happens. And that brings us to the end. In conclusion, I would say that Kling 3 is incredible. It clearly shows that these tools are not going anywhere. They're only going to improve. I hope you liked it. Leave a comment about what you'd like to see next, and please subscribe. It really helps a lot.